A Hardened Heart. Ada smoothed her dress and quietly entered the queen's apartments. The queen was sitting in front of her mirror, and one of her maids was rapidly applying eye makeup to her face. "You called for me, my queen?" Ada said submissively. "Yes, quickly. Get my royal wig and crown. I've been summoned to the court," the queen instructed. "At this early hour?" Ada asked, more to herself than to the queen. "Yes." The queen paused for a moment before saying, with a cold edge in her voice, "Moses and Aaron are back." Ada hurried to the chest where the queen's finest jewels, crown, and headpiece were kept. Now she knew why the queen seemed so anxious. She was worried about another plague. In a few minutes, the queen was rapidly moving through the hallways, Ada at her side, and guards surrounding her. They came to the extravagant throne room and entered through a back door. Ada scanned the crowd as she took her place behind the queen's throne, which was to the left and on a lower tier than the pharaoh's. The pharaoh's face was dark and grim. He was already angry before Moses even entered the room. All of the chief magicians were there, writing on scrolls, mixing potions, and putting incense on the small fire pits that surrounded the room, giving off a sickly sweet scent. Some musicians sat in a corner, playing sad tunes on their reed flutes. More guards than usual had been stationed around the room, guarding all the doors. Ada felt uneasy. She knew that something big was going to happen. This was the first time that Pharaoh had called his queen to be with him when Moses and Aaron came. She had been there the first night, but other than that she hadn't seen Moses and Aaron again. Suddenly the heavy wooden doors were thrown open. Ada jumped. Moses and Aaron strode confidently into the room and down the rich carpet, staffs in hand, surrounded by guards. Ada noticed that Moses and Aaron seemed to be holding something in one hand, but it was concealed from her view. "Oh no," she thought. "Yahweh, please, can any mercy be shown? Can you please soften Pharaoh's heart?" Moses and Aaron came up to the dais, and Aaron said, "Pharaoh, Yahweh has commanded you to let his people go, that they may serve him in the wilderness. You have time and again ignored the voice of the Lord Yahweh. Now tell us, what will your answer be? Will you again persist in hardness of heart? Will Yahweh again have to show you his awesome power?" The Pharaoh's lips were curled up in a sneer. "I already told you that I don't know your God, and I refuse to let your people go. My magicians have shown that they can imitate almost every plague that your weakling God has sent our way. I am prepared to hold my ground. I will not let your people go." There was a long, dreadful pause as Pharaoh stared down, long and hard, into Moses' eyes. Moses let out a long, sad sigh. Then he said, "Pharaoh, you have brought this upon yourself and your innocent people." At this, Pharaoh's eyes grew a little wider and his face a shade paler. "Behold, the power of Yahweh," Moses finished. Immediately Moses and Aaron opened their hands and threw something that looked like dark dust into the air. It fell to the floor, softly blanketing the marble in a fine, dark dust. Moses and Aaron turned as one and left the room. A magician scrambled out from behind his table and ran to where the dust had settled. He touched it with his finger and examined it. "It's soot, Lord Pharaoh," the magician said. "Soot?" Pharaoh said, scoffing. "Yes, sir." The magician rose to his feet, a wicked grin spreading across his face. Suddenly his face turned white. He cried out a little and clutched his hand. The next moment several shouts of pain sounded from the soldiers who had been closest to the soot. The Pharaoh jumped to his feet, his face ashen. "What's going on?" he demanded. A chorus of voices answered, but Ada couldn't make out what they were saying. She felt the queen clutching her arm. "Ada, take me back at once," she gasped out. "My queen, is something wrong? Are you—" Ada froze. Her eyes opened wide with horror. Huge boils, painful and blistering, were breaking out all over the queen's arms. Ada looked into the queen's eyes. They were full of pain and terror. "Guards, the queen needs to go to her apartments now," Ada commanded. The queen and herself were quickly surrounded by guards and brought back to the queen's apartments. The queen collapsed on her bed, crying in pain and agony. Ada hurried to get ointment and bandages. All around her the Egyptians' maids were breaking out with boils. They were screaming and running around frantically, scratching at the boils and trying to find relief. "Please, Yahweh," Ada whispered as she pulled the bandages from a closet. "Protect me and let me be a witness to the Egyptians here. I know you put me here for a purpose. Please let me fulfill that purpose and give me strength and courage to endure anything you send my way." With that brief, fervent prayer, Ada ran off to minister to those in pain. "Good morning," Amasai called from the doorway. "Shalom, you look well," Father called back. "I am well," Amasai replied jovially. "Work is postponed." A chorus of cheers arose from the family members. Tirza and Raphael danced around the room, and Yanni screamed in delight. But Mother rose from her stool in the corner and demanded, "Why? Why has work been postponed?" "Another plague. Yahweh once again has worked a miracle through Moses and Aaron. Early this morning, Moses and Aaron threw soot in the Pharaoh's presence. The soot caused boils to break out on all the Egyptians. They are in so much pain and agony that they can barely walk. Until they are well enough to tell us what to do, I believe we'll have a much-needed break. I'll tell you now when work is resumed in full swing. It would be wonderful if your family could bring in some more straw to the marketplace over the course of the day, but other than that you have no other obligations." "Good day," Amasai said as he headed for the door. "We will. Good day, Amasai," Father shouted after him. Freedom! Oh, thank you, Yahweh. Jara's heart soared until her mother shouted at the younger children, "Quiet, all of you! I've had enough of this celebrating over the doom of the gods. All of you, get to work and get out of my sight. I have cloth to weave." Mother plopped down at her stool and began weaving cloth. The loud cackling of the loom quickly forced everyone out of doors. "Father, what did Mother mean? Did something else happen to another Egyptian god?" Tirza asked as she skipped up to where her father was preparing the wagon to get more straw. "Well, Tirza," Father began, swinging Tirza up into the back of the cart, "I'm not well versed in the Egyptian gods, but I know your mother prays quite frequently to the goddess Bast. I believe she is supposed to be the goddess of joy, health, and healing, and is supposed to give protection against contagious diseases." "Are the boils contagious?" Tirza asked innocently. Father nodded. "Usually boils are very contagious. They can also be painful. We must pray for the Egyptians to be healed. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. I guess they don't have very powerful gods, do they?" Tirza queried, furrowing her brows. Father grinned as he picked up the ox goad. "Well, the Egyptians' gods aren't real, so they technically have no power at all," he explained. "Father, can I come too?" Jara questioned, running up beside the wagon. "Of course." Father grabbed her hands and lifted her into the wagon. "You're strong," Jara said with a giggle. "Not really," Father replied, tweaking her nose with his finger. "You're just little." "I'm 12. I'm not little. I'm almost a woman," Jara protested. "Yes, you are, but you'll always be my little girl to me." He smiled on her fondly, tucking a stray strand of hair into her head covering. He turned away and struck the oxen on the back, heading them out to the marsh. Jara laughed as the wagon bounced up and down over ruts and holes. "Yahweh, thank you for letting us be free, just for one day, and thank you for showing me your power," Jara whispered. I think I want to trust you with everything in my life, but I still have some unbelief and fear too. Can you help me with that, please? Amen." Pharaoh chuckled a low, deep, menacing chuckle as he saw Moses and Aaron again approaching him. The first rays of sunlight were stealing into the throne room and made the red carpet glow eerily. "I see that the boils have finally gone, Moses," he said, laughing aloud. "Your God doesn't seem to be able to let these plagues last for more than a week. I believe it is clear that our gods have been able to give us back our health." Moses shook his head and replied softly, "Pharaoh, how long will your heart be hardened? As long as you and your wretched brother persist in playing these games with me and demanding that I let your people go." Pharaoh spat, enraged. Aaron stepped forward, strong, determined. "Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would then have been cut off from the earth. But indeed, for this reason I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, and in order to proclaim my name through the earth. Still, you exalt yourself against my people by not letting them go. Behold, about this time tomorrow, I will send a very heavy hail, such as has not been seen in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore send, bring your livestock and whatever you have in the field to safety. Every man and beast that is found in the field and is not brought home when the hail comes down on them will die." The pharaoh's face was dark with hatred and anger. He leapt from his throne and practically screamed, "No one tells me what to do! You get out of my sight! If you dare to speak such words to me again, you will feel the consequences!" Before Moses and Aaron could say anything more, soldiers surrounded them and forcefully escorted them from the throne room. Pharaoh sat back on his throne, breathing heavily. Pharaoh's advisors and the prince's tutor, Panj, waited a moment before approaching the throne. With tremulous steps, Panj knelt in front of the pharaoh. "My lord?" "What is it?" Pharaoh snapped. Panj took a deep breath and started rubbing his hands together nervously. "Shouldn't we consider what Moses and Aaron have said? If another plague is on its way, shouldn't we take precautions and keep the few cattle and animals we have and our servants safe?" The pharaoh turned dark, flashing eyes upon his advisor. "Have you grown soft, Panj?" he said in a low, dangerous tone. Abruptly he rose and shouted out to the court, "Listen to me, all of you. If you have that much doubt in our gods that you don't think they can protect us from a little hail, then fine! Go lock up your precious belongings. But I say to you that the pharaoh shall not lock up his cattle and his servants. To do so would be to admit to the world that I am afraid of a god of slaves and doubt my own strength and power. I am the morning and the evening star, and I wield strength and power. Everyone to the temple to pray. We will ask the gods to once again protect us." Pharaoh stomped down the stairs of the dais and out the door towards one of the many temples, surrounded by many courtiers and guards. Panj still knelt on the marble floor, his sweaty hands still working against each other. "Panj, will you not go to pray to the gods?" another advisor asked him. No, not yet. I'm going to tell my servants to get my cattle and goods stored away. What little is left of them," Panj said, standing slowly. "Are you out of your mind? Didn't you hear what Pharaoh said?" the other advisor exclaimed, his eyes wide with wonder and fear. "Yes, I did. But he said that if we wanted, we could put our animals and goods away. And that is just what I plan to do. I've seen enough to know that this Yahweh isn't a god to trifle with. If you have a sensible head on your shoulders, you'll do the same." The other advisor stood rooted to the spot. He rarely saw Panj this bold, this immovable. Could he make a stand for what he believed? Did he really believe that his gods didn't have power anymore? "No, I can't," he murmured. Avoiding Panj's gaze, he left down the stairs and towards the temple. Panj sighed and he hurried from the court. He had much to do before tomorrow morning. "Ada? Ada?" Someone was shaking her. Ada groaned a little and tried so hard to open her eyes. She was so tired, so weary. "Ada, it's Lexine. You need to wake up. The queen needs you." Ada forced her eyes open. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. She had overslept. "I'll be right there," she muttered groggily. Lexine darted away to the queen as Ada pushed herself off of her bed and stumbled towards the chest where her dresses were kept. "Yahweh, give me strength. Give me energy," she murmured, slipping a white dress over her head. "I praise you that I didn't get sick with the boils, but there were so few Israelites and so many sick Egyptians. I've worn myself out helping them. Please, please be my help now." Ada splashed water over her face and pulled her hair back with a jeweled comb. She breathed in deeply, feeling a little more refreshed and definitely more peaceful. She was almost walking with a spring in her step as she entered the queen's apartments. "My queen, you look so much better today," Ada exclaimed. "Yes, I think the boils have left at last," the queen said, but she didn't seem very happy. She looked worried. "Please, Ada, get my most ornate wig and jewelry. The pharaoh has asked me to pray at the temple. It sounds like Moses is threatening to call another plague down on us. We must pray fervently for protection." Ada quickly obeyed the queen's commands. As she adjusted the wig on the queen's head, she whispered softly, her voice shaking, "If I may be so bold, your majesty, I'm afraid that your gods won't provide you the protection you need. Perhaps if you let me pray with you to Yahweh, he will not inflict another plague upon Egypt." The queen took a deep breath, then rose and faced Ada. She was scowling and looked very proud and regal as she threw her shoulders back and looked Ada in the eyes. Her expression was cold as she said, "Ada, you know how I feel about you speaking about Yahweh to me. I ask you to remember your position and remember my command to refrain from talking about him to me. I have respected your request and not forced you to go to the Egyptian worship services with us. Now you must respect my request. Is that understood?" Ada bowed her head and curtsied in reverence. "Yes, my lady. I understand. Please forgive me for overstepping my position. Very well. The queen made a little gesture with her hand, dismissing Ada. Make sure my lunch is ready when I return, Ada, she called after her as she marched out the door, surrounded by her many Egyptian maids. Ada shook her head. Tears stood in her eyes, but she blinked them back. The queen had often responded in a similar way when Ada spoke about Yahweh. She was very close to the queen, and the queen hadn't been an unjust mistress. If only she could help the queen see the truth. Still despondent, Ada walked towards the kitchen to order the queen's lunch. Good morning, a friendly voice said. Pocky, I was hoping to run into you, Ada said, making an effort to be joyful. Oh, really? Pocky was giving her a curious look. The way his eyes met hers made Ada feel uncomfortable. I have a message from my family. Can you deliver it for me? Of course. What would you like to say? Tell them that Yahweh has given me strength, that I didn't get sick with the boils, and that the queen is feeling much better. Also let them know that I'm praying for them and that I miss them. I think I can do that, Pocky said, grinning. He was staring at her in that weird way again. I can't go today, though. My father needs help with some repairs on the Pharaoh's chariot. Is it all right if I deliver it first thing tomorrow morning? Of course. I didn't mean to inconvenience you in any way. If you're not able to, I can just wait in. Oh, no, it's really all right, Pocky assured her. I'd be happy to do anything for you. Why is he looking at me like that? Ada couldn't help but wonder. She was feeling very uncomfortable. Thank you, Pocky. I must be going now. I have a lot to do before the queen returns. Goodbye. Ada hurried away, feeling awkward and confused, and just a tiny bit worried, too. Goodbye. I'll see you soon, Pocky called after her. Right, Ada whispered, hoping that Pocky wasn't thinking of her as anything more than a friend. She barely knew him. He just helped her out from time to time, though she appreciated that he had been so kind and serving. Maybe you're just imagining it, she told herself, and then quickly dismissed all her thoughts on the matter. It was time for her to throw herself into her other tasks and stop thinking about weird looks from young men. Jara set the table before breakfast, hoping Father and Eaton would be back soon. Mother was in a sour mood, and it was making everyone nervous. She heard footsteps at the door and turned eagerly, hoping it was Father and Eaton and not MSI. Work had started up again 2 days ago, and the foreman had been coming early so that they could catch up on work. To her relief, Father and Eaton entered. But then Jara gasped in surprise. In between them was a young Egyptian man who was badly battered and bruised. He was wearing the linen skirt of a servant, but he seemed too young to be working as an overseer. He was not armed, not even with a whip, and Jara thought that he looked slightly familiar. Asher, who's that, and why is he here? Jara's mother exclaimed. Egyptians never came into Hebrew houses. It's a young man who was on his way to Goshen when a huge hailstorm started. He continued to run until he got to our village. However, when he got here, nobody would help him. We will help him. I'm ashamed that the Israelites should be so unkind and inconsiderate. Shayna, mix up some herbs and get some cool water. We'll put that on his bruises to help with the swelling and pain, their father commanded. Hail, Mother said with a disbelieving laugh as Shayna hurried to do as her father asked. What are you talking about? It's true, Father declared. There's a huge hailstorm taking place in all the land of Egypt except for here. The hailstones are the size of our clay cups. It's incredible. Everything is being utterly destroyed. It's almost as if fire were raining down upon the Egyptians along with the hail. I have never seen anything like it in my entire life. Here you are, Eaton said cordially, handing a cup of water to the young man, who looked to be about his own age. Thank you, the young man murmured as he lifted the clay cup to his lips and drank deeply. He was tall and handsome, and his face looked softer than the cruel overseer's. Everyone was so quiet that Jara could hear a fly buzzing around the room. Shayna had finished crushing up the desired herbs and handing them and some water to her father, who made a poultice out of it and began to apply it gently to the man's bruises. Shayna stood by, ready to assist. She was a good nurse. Other than Father and Shayna, no one else moved or said a word. They just stared at the Egyptian. Where have I seen him before? Jara wondered. His face looked so familiar. She then noticed that Lemuel's brow was furrowed, like he, too, was trying to remember something. When he finished applying the poultice, Father asked, What's your name, young man? My name is Pocky, and I am very grateful to you and your family for your kindness, the young man replied. He gave Jara a friendly smile. Oh, it's the Egyptian that helped me and Lemuel out of Ramesses that night when I was caught by the soldier. He seems so nice and kind, not like most of the other Egyptians. What kind of work do you do, Pocky? Their father continued, trying to make conversation. I'm a servant in the palace of the Pharaoh. Paki replied. I came to Goshen this morning to deliver a message to Jaden from his daughter Ada. He lives close by. Do you know Jaden and Ada? At the mention of Ada's name from this young man's lips, Eaton's face turned a little bit paler, and he paid rapt attention to the Egyptian's words. Jara took special notice of his reaction. Yes, they're our neighbors. Now that you mention it, I believe I've seen you come to their door a few times, father stated. Yes, I frequently deliver messages from Ada to her family. Since she's the queen's personal attendant, she can't leave the queen's side. I have good standing as a servant, and my father is Pharaoh's charioteer. Thus I'm free to come and go often, and I enjoy helping Ada. I'm grateful you're looking out for the Hebrews' best interest, father said gratefully as he offered Paki some more water. Paki rose to go. Thank you again for your kindness, but I really must be going. Are you sure you don't want to stay here until the storm passes? Father asked, a little worried. No, but thank you for your offer. I will go to Jaden's house and deliver Ada's message and then see what is to be done from there. Again, thank you for your kindness. And with a slight nod of his head, he left, though very slowly and appearing a little disoriented. There was a long pause before Father said, with forced joyfulness, Well, he was a nice young man, and because of this hailstorm, I doubt we'll be working today. It's truly a miracle how the hail is all around us. You should all go to the street and see for yourself. Everyone hurried outside. Jara drew in her breath in astonishment. Oh my, she heard Lemuel murmur at her side. A thick curtain of torrential rain and hail surrounded the land of Goshen. Jara could see it stretching for miles. It was dark, gray, and menacing. Jara saw huge stone-like things falling from the sky. If she could see the hail from this distance, it must be huge. Lightning flickered across the sky, and Jara could hear the low, deep rumble of thunder starting in the distance. It's definitely a work of Yahweh, Father said, coming up behind Jara and laying a hand on her shoulder. A little while ago there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Eaton and I saw the mass of clouds appear so abruptly that we didn't know where they came from. It's phenomenal. Everyone nodded their heads and agreed with Father. Jara heard a soft noise and turned to see Mother crying and shuffling into the hut. Father saw it too, and exhaled sorrowfully. Eaton, let's go talk to Amasai and see what is to be done today. Lemuel, until I get back, take the boys and go look after the animals. Shayna, you and the girls help your mother until I return. Yes, sir, Shayna said, going back inside after her mother. Are you well, Eaton? You look really pale, Lemuel said. Jara looked into Eaton's face. He didn't look right. He looked worried, and maybe a little vexed and angry. What's wrong? Jara asked him, a little alarmed. Nothing much. I'm just thinking, Eaton replied quickly. He was trying to be nonchalant, but it wasn't working. Jara could hear tension in his voice. But before she could ask anything else, Eaton spun on his heel and followed their father, still looking a little dejected. I wonder what's wrong with him, Jara thought. Maybe, does it have something to do with Ada? It was evening. The hailstorm was still raining down upon the land of Egypt, everywhere except for Goshen. Eaton climbed up one of the rolling hills behind their house and plopped down on the ground. He needed to think. His head was in a whirl, even though his face remained tranquil. He knew that he would never, ever forget today. This morning, on his walk with Father, they had decided that Eaton was ready to ask for Ada's hand in marriage that very day. That's when they found that Egyptian, Paki, staggering down the street and decided to help him. And that's when Paki talked about Ada. Eaton couldn't help but feel worried. This young man was obviously very attractive and kind, and he seemed to do favors for Ada all of the time. In spite of his injuries, Paki's face lit up when he mentioned Ada's name. Was he wooing her? Did Ada like Paki? Eaton had been rehearsing what to say to Jaden all day long, and the conversation which had just taken place had gone very well. Sir, I would like to ask your permission to marry your daughter, Ada. I've watched her for years, and her beautiful spirit, serving ways, and love for Yahweh drew me to her. Yahweh has told me that Ada is the girl I should be pursuing. I promise I will protect her with my very life and cherish her above everything else. Do I have your permission to marry her, sir? Though his heart had been pounding and his face was as white as a sheet, Eaton had been able, by Yahweh's grace, to stay calm and reserved through the whole talk. Jaden had been elated and had given Eaton permission almost immediately, saying that he had been observing Eaton's character for years and was more than willing to give Ada into his care. But there was a problem. Well, several actually. First, Ada was at the palace all of the time. Jaden hadn't seen Ada in over 6 months. Eaton and his family were very lucky to be able to see her almost every week, but Eaton rarely saw her without anyone else there. They both knew that getting private messages back and forth would be very difficult. And another thing, Since Ada was the queen's personal attendant, Jaden doubted that she'd be allowed to marry. He suspected that the queen didn't want her favorite servants running off, getting married, and starting a family. Then they'd be of no help around the palace. And then there was Pocky. Jaden was not sure of this, but he suspected that Pocky wanted a relationship with Ada. It was just something that Jaden could sense deep down inside. Pocky seemed a nice enough young man, but as Jaden had said, the thought of me giving my daughter in marriage to a pagan is horrible, and as long as it's in my power, she'll never be his bride. But the problem was that it was not in Jaden's power. Ada was in the palace, which was where Pocky spent his days. It made sense that if Ada was allowed to marry at all, that she'd end up marrying someone who worked in the palace. Eaton let out a long breath through his nose and ran his fingers through his hair. For once, he didn't know what to do. He could only hope that Ada wouldn't agree to marry Pocky and would somehow be able to marry him instead. But how was he even supposed to tell her his intentions? How was he supposed to get permission from the queen? Dozens of plans ran through his mind. Could he possibly get a job at the palace? That plan seemed to be laced with difficulties. Even if he could get a position, who knew where he'd be working and if he'd ever be able to see Ada? Very few Hebrew males worked in the palace because of security reasons. And if they did, they were the lowest class of slaves, nothing important enough to be around the queen's ladies in waiting. It was at times like these that Eaton desperately wished he was educated enough to write. If he could write a note, he could slip it into Ada's hand the next time they went to deliver cloth. But he couldn't write, and he didn't know anyone who did. Again, he sighed. He waited so long to be given permission to marry the beautiful young lady, and now that he had permission, it seemed like every way of access to her was cut off. He felt absolutely hopeless and very upset and alone. What could he do? There had to be some way of getting Ada out of this situation. Then Eaton suddenly realized something. He'd been sitting here, feeling miserably helpless like he couldn't do anything, and he realized he could do something. He could pray, of course. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Surely Yahweh would know how to get him and Ada together. After all, Yahweh was the one who had planted a desire for Ada in Eaton's heart in the first place. Feeling a little more relieved and at peace, Eaton poured out his soul to Yahweh as he had never done before. It was hard for him to reveal his deepest emotions. It always had been. But when Eaton was done praying and stood up to go back to the house, he felt like a different man, and he was glad he'd laid bare his soul before Yahweh at last. The hailstorm lasted about a day, and when it was over, all the flax and barley fields were completely destroyed, as it had been about time for them to be harvested. The Egyptians were devastated. They would have to spend a lot of money to get enough food to last until next harvest. Also, they traded a lot of their food to get other luxuries from the neighboring kingdoms. How could they keep up their trading status without that food? However, the Pharaoh again hardened his heart, for it was just time to plant the wheat. Surely they would get a good crop of that. But that was hardly a comfort to the poor, ruined Egyptian nation. How much more will it take until the Egyptians let us go? Jara pondered as she brought some fruits and vegetables to the queen a few days after the storm. The Pharaoh had ordered the Israelites to provide food from their own gardens for the people in the palace. Several families had given some small additions of food to Mother, and they now had enough for the queen for several days while the Egyptians were waiting for more food to be imported. Eaton had offered to accompany Jara to the palace. He silently strode by her side, deep in thought. He'd hardly said a word since they left their house. Jara guessed that Ada was on his mind. Perhaps she would be able to tell when they got to the palace tonight. As they traversed through the town, they saw destruction on every side. The streets were full of holes, and its immaculate appearance was gone. Many roofs on the houses had caved in. Structures made of sticks were completely demolished. There was hardly a green thing to be seen, and an eerie silence reigned in the streets. They didn't talk much, for they didn't want to break the suffocating silence. The shadows were now beginning to lengthen, and they both mechanically began to pick up their pace so as to get back home before it was dark. The silhouettes of ruined buildings fell across their path, giving the whole city an ominous air. They turned a corner, and Jara saw Asenath's house. She clutched the bread that she had stuffed in the sash of her dress. It had been left over from dinner. The boys had rushed outside without taking it, so Jara had cautiously asked her mother if she could have it. "You might as well," her mother grunted. "It won't last till morning." Jara had put it in her sash, hoping to give it to Asenath and Bess. She was sure they needed some food. As they neared Asenath's door, Jara said, "I'm going to run over here for a minute." She turned towards the house, but Eaton didn't seem to hear her. He kept walking down the road. Eaton? Huh? What? Eaton started a little and looked at his sister in bewilderment. I'm going over here for a minute, Jara said again, smiling a little at Eaton's bewilderment. Oh, sure, Eaton muttered, lapsing back into silence. Jara ran over to Asenath's house and knocked on the door. In a moment the door opened slightly and Asenath's small face appeared. She looked like she'd been crying and her face was pale, pained, and weary, but her expression brightened quickly upon seeing Jara. Jara, what are you doing here? It's so good to see you again. It's good to see you too. How's Bess? Good, but hungry. We usually get food from the temple where my father performs his services, but, well, no one has money to spend on sacrifices. And, well, father's been drinking. We had some wine saved up and he's been very drunk for the past several days. I don't know what to do. A big tear rolled down Asenath's dark cheek. Well, I can't stay. We're bringing food to the palace, but I saved some food from dinner. Here, I want you to have this. Jara took the large chunk of bread from her sash and gave it to Asenath. A radiant and beautiful smile burst like sunshine across Asenath's face. Oh, Jara, thank you so much. May the gods bless you. Jara grinned. Well, I'm glad to help, but I don't think your gods will bless me. I believe in the one true God. His name is Yahweh. Asenath wrinkled her forehead as if she was confused. I've heard of him. He seems so different than our gods. Is he really more powerful than ours? Oh, yes, Jara said emphatically. I'll have to tell you more about him later. My brother and I need to get to the palace and then get back home before our curfew time. All right, I look forward to it. Asenath smiled that beautiful smile again. Thank you, Jara. I hope to see you again soon. Jara nodded, smiled, and darted back up to join Eaton. Who was that? Eaton asked, a little distractedly. Her name's Asenath. I met her a couple of months ago. I've seen her a couple of times since. I wanted to give her some of our food. She has a younger brother who needs it. Eaton barely acknowledged what she said. Jara was a little hurt. Usually Eaton took a great interest in her friends, but now he wasn't saying anything. Where had the encouraging side of her big brother gone? Eaton, is something wrong? Jara asked, a little hesitantly. No, not really. Why do you ask? Eaton shot her a sidelong glance. You just don't seem very happy, and usually you're more interested in what I do. It was hard for Jara to say that, but she felt it had to be said. Eaton shrugged. I'm sorry. I guess I'm just not feeling myself today, he explained, vaguely. He didn't say anything more, and so Jara fell silent, too. Finally, the brother and sister reached the small kitchen and courtyard. It, too, was hardly recognizable. None of the finery had escaped desolation. There were only a few pieces of shredded cloth left from the soft embroidered cushions. None of the plants were alive. Their withered bodies lay smashed and bruised on the stone floor. There were bits and pieces of broken pottery everywhere, and the fountain was not playing. The courtyard was very gray and dark, not sunny and cheerful as it usually was. Eaton stepped up to the door and knocked. The hollow sound resounded through the stillness and seemed to last for an eternity. The door swung open, but instead of Ada's lovely, hopeful face, there was another cold, dark one. Tara quickly recognized it as the face of Tahara, the cook. The cook took the food and muttered a despairing thank you. She turned away quickly and started to close the door. A quick look of panic crossed Eaton's face, but he composed himself almost immediately. Stepping forward very calmly, Eaton put a firm hand on the door to keep it open. Tahara glared at him. Ada here? Eaton asked in a quiet, steady voice. We usually see her when we come to deliver things. She's busy and cannot be seen, Tahara responded coldly, and she slammed the door. Eaton let out a melancholy sigh. Jara, too, felt rather rumpled from this encounter. I wonder if she's all right, Eaton said under his breath. Then he turned to Jara and said, Wait here. I'm going to try and find her. Eaton, please don't, Jara exclaimed in terror. Why not? Do you want to make sure she's all right? But you haven't seen inside the palace, Jara protested frantically. It's huge in there. You'll never be able to find her without being discovered yourself. And if you're found, you'll certainly be punished. Please don't. It's bad enough that Ada's in there. I don't want both of you in there, not knowing what's happening to you. And besides, you can't leave me out here alone. The last point decided the matter for Eaton, and he slowly nodded and whispered, You're right. He sighed again. Let's go home. Silence again enveloped them as the pair made their way back through the gathering gloom and ruined houses. Eaton, Jara finally ventured, you really like Ada, don't you? A slight blush colored Eaton's face. He smiled a soft, thoughtful smile and replied, a little hesitantly, I like Ada very much. She's a beautiful young lady, inside and out. His smile grew bigger. Do you love her? Jara queried, almost in a whisper. She hoped that wasn't pushing it too far. Eaton stopped and looked at her, but yet he seemed to be looking past her, too. There was a faraway look in his eyes. Yes, he murmured, with all my heart. Jara couldn't hide the grin that stole over her face. That's wonderful. Are you going to try and marry her? Eaton looked away from her and started walking again. I got Jaden's permission, but Yahweh is going to have to perform a miracle if he wants me to marry Ada. I don't know how I'm supposed to get in to ask her, and there's the very likely possibility that the queen will say no. And, well, I think there are other young men in the way, Eaton finished. He sounded sad now, almost disheartened. You mean Pocky? Jara asked in surprise. Yes, Eaton answered simply. Do you think he loves Ada too? Jara asked soberly, hardly wanting to hear what Eaton's response was. Eaton shrugged. I don't know. And at this point, I'm powerless to control anything. It's in Yahweh's hands, Jara. Jara could hear a heaviness in Eaton's voice as if he was carrying a great burden. Then he continued. If Ada wishes to marry Pocky, I won't stand in her way. He seemed almost relieved to say that. Jara was rather taken aback. That's very selfless of you, Eaton. You must really love her. Eaton smiled at her, his first genuine smile of the night. He quickly grew solemn again as he said, Please, Jara, don't tell anyone about this. Father and Lemuel know, of course, but I'd rather keep it until we see what Yahweh works out. I especially don't want Tirzah to know. She'd tell everyone in Goshen, he said, giving her a knowing look. Jara laughed aloud. I promise I won't tell anyone, especially Tirzah, Jara vowed, flashing her brother a big grin. She was thrilled and honored that Eaton had confided in her. Thanks, Eaton said with relief, grinning back.